Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
It's far too hot, isn't it?
Well, at least we're not having to sit in a council chamber with 39 other people, or more than 39 other people next week.
Cool, yeah. I mean, I look at it at the moment. I mean, those who are watching live are blessed because I've finally decided to put a shirt on, which was not my primary arrangements for most of the day. And if I look at, if I was looking forward to Tuesday, now I don't know what the air conditioning's like in the council chamber, but I'm going to guess unspectacular.
I think it involves opening the windows.
Oh, which, if outside of the window, the temperature is the same as a cream of mushroom soup, then oh. So yes, we're although there's a slightly end of term feel about the timing of our show, as I think Parliament rises Tuesday week, and this is the last full council meeting before the holidays. Rather than them agreeing to sit down and watch a nice film like Toy Story for a couple of hours, as you might hope, instead it's a monster of an agenda.
Yeah, indeed. As you say, the last one before they're all going on a summer holiday. So 13 items on the agenda paper, as well as an extraordinary meeting ahead of just before the full council about appointing some aldermen to the city. But yeah, so 13 items on the full council agenda, and 11 items in 11 notices of motion. So there are 11 motions.
Wow,
Make
that's
that
midnight, isn't it? That they ain't getting out. They're not getting out Tuesday, I don't reckon.
Well, we could perhaps run a book on, not that we have a gambling license, but or indeed any prizes to give anybody if they get it right. But if someone wants to make a guess as to how long they think the council meeting will go, we'll happily encourage that whimsical guess.
Absolutely. So we are going to attempt to save our listeners the pain and the agony of watching the whole thing live by rattling through all 11 motions in an hour, giving our insightful wisdom, and might have a little muse as to whether they will pass or fail. But yeah, you've got the list. Through to whatever the 11th of the hour is.
So that sounds like the start of a Pet Shop horse. You've got the list.
Yeah, I've got the looks. Yeah, possibly not.
So the first motion that we've got, A is about North End Bank. So this is from the Lib Dems. It's from Councillor Lee Hunt and Jason Frasackley. Basically on the back of residents' petition asking the cabinet to write to banks and ask them to send representatives to a meeting with local councillors, trade representatives and regeneration officers to discuss the situation that North End doesn't have any banks, and calling on Penny Mordaunt to raise that with ministers.
Yeah, again, this is an odd one because Jason Frasackley, friend of the pod, and Lee Hunt, very decent fellow. But this seems like madness to me. I don't understand why you're trying to. Banks have the option to open and close their branches where they choose, where there might be footfall. And we tried this week to give our custom to a small independent shop in North End. And I say try. We got there in the end, having driven down there and driven round and round and round for 15, 20 minutes. Not ideal for the climate. Couldn't park, so drove away again. In the end, had to send two people down the next day. Pulled into a bus stop, threw the person out, and they did the business while the other person drove round and round. So I kind of I do struggle in terms of, well, how are you going to make North End, if you can't, if people can't park and can't get there, the footfall is going to be low. So trying to persuade a bank to open a bank where nobody goes, surely a song in that, futile gesture for me.
Okay, I find it interesting, and when we come to one later on about which was the motion about Hilsea Community Centre, it's interesting that this one leads with it's about a petition led by residents. So this is saying it's being driven by a community need that's documented. But again, I don't know whether because the problem is that no one bank is going to see enough custom to need to have one open, and really, surely some sort of solution would be, whether that would be the post office or whether that would be a shared entity, that there was a physical presence of a bank, but that was actually a physical outlet that people could use regardless of which bank they banked with.
Hmm.
Because rather than having one for whatever the slew of 4 to 6 different high street banks, or we call them high street banks as a misnomer these days, don't we? Because they're not really on the high street anymore. But you don't need a NatWest, you don't need a Santander, you don't need
Yep.
you don't need all of those other ones. So you just need somewhere where traders can come in and cash in some coins for anybody that's using cash these days, and for those that either don't like to or aren't able to, for various reasons, to use internet banking, can come in and make deposits and etc. So yeah, to me, I don't know that the solution is within the power of the local council.
Absolutely. So we have a look at motion B, which is around the cost of living crisis, which has been tabled by Susie Orton and Steve Pitt. Now, this is one of those ones where, and I think this applies to quite a few, and when we were doing the pre-production meeting, yes, listeners, we do some pre-production meetings so that we don't...
I know, it's a
Yeah,
shock.
we actually do some planning. There's almost an element of this motion has got so much politicised language in it from the Lib Dems that it's very difficult to read it and sort through what it is you're actually asking for, because it's kind of a sort of stream of consciousness about the rising cost of fuel and the inflationary pressures and pressures on households and the rise in the rate of national insurance brackets, which I find very strange, owing to the fact it's a Lib Dem policy to have a hypothecated tax to pay for the social care and the NHS, obviously income tax, not national insurance. But anyway, now's not the right time to be doing that. So there's a whole list of bad things that the government have done, good things that the local council have done. And in essence, the motion asks the council to ask the government to give them lots more money so that they can do more good things to offset the dreadful things that the government is doing. Have I missed anything critical from the motion there, Simon, or is my slightly cheeky paraphrasing covered the main points?
Yeah, I mean, I found it interesting that if I hadn't have told you who it came from, I suspect that you wouldn't have guessed who it came from. As
Oh
in
no, it had the Labour team written all over it. It was, we call upon the council to tell the government they smell bad. Perhaps they wouldn't have been quite so complimentary about the actions of the local council. But again, this was one that was mired in politics speak. And when you took all of that away, it was that, I'm sure many councils would like to ask the government for some more money. In fact, I'm fairly sure that everybody would like to ask the government for some more money. But I'm not sure that yeah.
I mean, I have to say these are all, personally, these are all policies that I think these requests are all kind of sound and reasonable. But it's the sort of thing that you and I have discussed before that councils ask for. That essentially, I'm presuming that they land in an in tray somewhere in Whitehall, and someone goes, "That's not going to happen,"
Yeah.
and under
Yeah.
us. So, so from a kind of from that kind of perspective, it's an Oliver motion, isn't it? In the sense, I'm going to call it an Oliver motion.
Yeah, please, sir. Can I have some more?
Yeah.
More?
But, it was asking for things like windfall tax on oil and gas to give £600 off per household for energy bills, reviewing the energy cap, forecourt prices, investing more money. So there's quite a slew of things. It talks about reducing VAT, but not specifically about, because VAT on energy is 5%. So I'm surprised that actually reducing the VAT on energy wasn't in there rather than just the plain VAT. So there's lots of things in there, but they're almost general election policies.
Yes, and because it's things like the tax on energy companies. If you remember, Boris wasn't going to do it, Rishi wasn't going to do it, we're not going to do it, it's unconservative. And then when they announced the first £624, £324 for the 650 that went into 8 million households, 5 million of that was 5 billion rather, was raised by an additional tax on the oil and gas companies. So there is a little bit of we
Yeah, but
kind of.
I think the way that Sunak enacted that though gave so many loopholes that it's possible that actual windfall levy that they've raised won't actually raise the amount of money that they're certainly lining up to spend.
Oh no,
So
I mean, to be fair, they were transparent. It was only 5 of the 21 billion that
yeah,
this package is going to cost. So
yeah.
yeah, I mean, in the interest of time, it all very noble, but no. But this is one that I think could, because there's so much in it. I think there could be an awful lot of talking on this one before eventually. Will it get passed? I think it probably will, because I think the yellows and the reds will go for it. The blues will go against. Who knows what the independents will do? I think
Yeah,
that's the way this one's
I think
going.
it's going to get passed. There's going to be lots of talk about it. There'll probably be an amendment thrown in or two, maybe. I don't know. I didn't actually. I should have refreshed to see whether there were any amendments on there. But yeah, I think it's going to get passed just because of if you look at the seats that are progressives within the council, then they have the overall majority between them. So that was B. On to C. So C was that. Oh, my little thing hasn't come up on the screen. There we go. So cross-border licensing. So this is the first of a couple of motions that have come from the Portsmouth Independence Party.
Yep.
This one from Madrick and Madrick. I mean, they sound like a firm of solicitors, but they're not.
No.
It raises the interesting point that with regards to taxis and private hire vehicles, local authorities can only control the licenses that they actually issue, but they've got no way of stopping people who have licenses issued in other areas from operating within their jurisdiction. The motion talks about, for example, people using licenses that were issued nearly 200 miles away to operate in Portsmouth, and Portsmouth City Council are pretty much powerless to do anything about those. And whereas our council requires the licenses the parties who issues licenses to install CCTVs in their vehicles, whereas other local authorities might not be doing that. So that local authority is effectively coining in a bit of money to pay for the license, and
Yep.
then that taxi driver is operating in another city without kind of really any recourse. And what the motion pretty much says asks for the chair of the licensing committee to get in touch with the two city MPs and the Secretary of State for Transport, and to call for the Department of Transport to review this current loophole and sort it out and make licensing a local matter.
Well, I think there's an omission in this,
Okay,
which
not
is that.
not emissions.
No, an omission,
Oh, okay.
which is that. So Portsmouth Council, this is a bit taxi nerd moment. They issue the Hackney carriage licenses,
Mhm.
which is your taxi. You can only stop and pick somebody up off of the street hailing a cab if you are a Hackney carriage driver. If you're a private hire vehicle, you can only pick somebody up if they call you or they tap the app. So in terms of, so if somebody has driven down from West Bromwich and they're picking people up off of ranks or off of the street, they are effectively breaking the law. Now, I guess where the grey area comes is with the large chains such as Uber. And I don't know how their platform works, whether they've got drivers who can, drive down into Portsmouth to look for more lucrative work. So I think there is an element of, I'm not sure the whole story is being told here, but again, I this is another one where again it's write to somebody and ask them to do something, but I'm not entirely sure what they're being asked to do. Because it is a local matter. Portsmouth City Council limits the number of hackney carriage licenses that it issues, and it limits the number of private hire licenses that it issues.
But it can't stop cars entering the city who've been issued licenses elsewhere, and can't manage those vehicles to which licenses have been issued. So it's not getting any control of that, and I'm presuming there's actually you actually pay for the license. So my apologies, taxi drivers, for us not researching that. But that's also the council aren't getting the revenue stream of being able to to be able to manage that. But the motion, to me, the motion is calling out and saying effectively the existing legislation doesn't do the job because it doesn't allow the local council control over the vehicles that enters its area. And to me, that although it's not within the council's power to gain the ability to manage those licenses, that is something that central government are going to have to change. But to me, I think that's actually a perfectly reasonable thing, because it's saying we've got this issue, it causes a problem for the city, but we don't have the power to deal with it. So can we have the power, please?
Well, but I guess this is where for me the powers become a little bit. So if I've got off of the train at Havant, and I've jumped in a Havant licensed hackney carriage that's outside Havant station, and I get it to drive me to Southsea, then at what point? And again, if after they've dropped me off at Southsea, they see somebody looking for a cab and offer to run them from Southsea to North End, then they're breaking the rules. They're not allowed to do that. So I think the challenge with it is it's a noble arrangement, but how you enforce it, with a big city like Portsmouth where, people may well taxi in from outside of the limits of the city, that's the bit for me which I haven't quite got my head around, how they expect to police that.
But that, I think that's what the motion's calling for. It's calling for the Department of Transport to review the loophole to be able to try to close that issue, so that you don't have one set of rules in the issuing local authority area, another set of rules in the local authority area where the business is being conducted. That's the issue. George Magic has popped into the chat saying that there's somewhere around 50 plus drivers registered in Wolverhampton driving in our city. So when you think about that, that's
it's not on the way. Funnily enough, today I was trying to book a hotel in Wolverhampton, which isn't as easy as you might think. Maybe I can speak.
If your taxi driver is taking you on the way from Havant train station to Wolverhampton,
no.
Swinging you for a.
So yeah, I mean, let's see how this one plays out. I think again, this is and again, if that means that they're registered in Wolverhampton, but they're working in the city, on a platform, on a national platform, then that's an area where that does need to be looked at.
Okay, so pesticides.
Yeah, pesticides. Report brought to the council by Charlotte Gerarda and
Judith Smythe.
See, I was struggling there for a minute because my screen reader read it out as Smith. Now, I am certain that Jeanette Smith, formerly of Baffin's Ward, and the People's Progressive Portsmouth group, she raised this 2 years ago, and I remember it because we had her on the podcast. So this is one of those ones where I think when we looked at it at the time, and again, without wishing to go back through history, everyone seemed to agree it was a jolly good idea. So the thing that I kind of am a bit puzzled about with this motion is that it's the same as one that passed a couple of years ago. So is there something subtly different that we haven't worked out from the motion? Or is this just a case of, oh, for Christ's sake, we said we'd do this. Can we just get on with it, please?
Without us having a comment from the administration, if I'm honest, it feels like the latter. So I mean, the motion is there's lots of references and call outs as to why this is the right and good thing from a point of view
Yep.
of it's impacting the lives of not just the workers actually treating these areas, but also the residents, and also affecting the biodiversity in Portsmouth at a time when we're supposedly trying to be encouraging that. But as you say, yeah, it was brought to full council in October 2021. If memory serves, wasn't it brought before in the aborted meeting that had to be stopped because the then Conservative council group leader then suddenly realised that he'd actually been tested positive for COVID, and then they had to abort the meeting. I've got a funny feeling it was one of the things on the ticket that day, but either way, it was brought to the council in October 2021, and the report came to cabinet in March 2022, and effectively, working to minimise use of pesticides, and be pesticide free wherever possible. But essentially, this is kind of saying, well, not enough has happened. And why is that kind of not happening? And could you please go away and look at it and come back with what the alternatives are? And your reason for not choosing an alternative can't just be about the cost. I guess what the motion is effectively kind of saying, if your risk assessment of the chemicals that are being used, you can't just be using cost. You've also got to have the health in it, the health concerns as part of that risk assessment, surely. So so it's calling for a report to cabinet within the next 6 months and an update biannually from the council leader, and involving local community groups about stopping pesticides use and involving them in trialing other methods of dealing with weeds and committing to phasing out these harmful chemicals over the next 3 years. So it's not saying stop them all by next week. It's saying
Yeah, and
patiently, despite actually how little seems to have changed in the length of time. It's saying, could we look at this again? Because we don't seem to be getting anywhere. And I can't say I can think of any other response
no,
other than why aren't we there yet?
no, absolutely, absolutely. And I'll defer that it was only October 21. I thought it was much longer ago than that. But no. Moving on, because I think we all universally agree, let's not kill people with pesticides. Which brings us on to our second motion by the Portsmouth Independents. This one tabled by David Simpson and I believe Madgwick the Younger, which is that Hilsea does not have a community centre, and it calls upon the administration to try and identify one.
Yeah,
I find
Russ. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Was it Russell? Sorry,
Yeah, Russ.
I don't know.
Yeah.
No, my apologies, Russell. I've got my Simpsons the wrong way around. I am having a first name mayor today. So, yeah, this one, Simon. It's a very short motion. And I've probably paraphrased it a bit, but there's an element of the bit that's missing for me with this is one about the identification of need. It's true to say that Hilsea doesn't have a community centre. But there are groups that meet in Hilsea, so there's an element of, you want to have a dedicated community centre. I guess there's the cost of setting one up and running one, and for me the demand's got to be there, hasn't it? Which this motion doesn't seem to identify.
If there were prizes given for brevity, I think it would win on that. Because
Yeah.
it is literally a four line motion. But yeah, in contrast to the earlier motion from the Lib Dems, it doesn't say that it's raising this issue on the back of residents calling for it or there being some sort of petition. Obviously, this will be something that the PRP perhaps have identified in their canvassing and speaking to voters that there's a need. I'm just thinking with my kind of project organisation hat on, I'm thinking if you're trying to purchase a building or set up any structure or organisation, your starting point is can we find a location? Your starting point is there a need? What's the budget?
Mm.
Then you start finding a location, because there's no point doing anything if there isn't a clear need, and you can't really do anything unless you've got a budget. So unless there's something bubbling away there, unless there's I don't know what's in the SIL pot money, so the community infrastructure levy for Hilsea, or what, whether that's kind of what they're going on. But to me, that, and I think there's an electioneering flavour in lots
Oh,
of motions, but I think
I,
this is an early May local electioneering, perhaps.
that is how it feels to me. It's that, I think I can already see it on an Independence leaflet now, which says the Portsmouth Independents called for a community centre for your community, and the evil Tories voted against it. So
But if
yeah, I'm a
there's a need for it, right? That's the key question. But perhaps there is. It's just that the motion doesn't state that there is. I don't know.
or evidence it. No, so no, not happy with that one.
Okay.
Right, you're on the next one.
So GPs for the city.
Yes.
So coming from Gerald Vernon Jackson and Matthew Winnington. So Portsmouth has one GP per just under 2,500 residents, which is about double the ratio that places like Oxford have. So they have a much fewer, patients,
Yep.
residents per GP, and essentially the motion's calling on the government and the cabinet for Portsmouth to be included in a trial allowing pharmacists to issue prescriptions. So perhaps
Yep.
trying to take the GPs out of the bottleneck for being able to gain access to medications, and to back Portsmouth City Council being able to directly employ GPs themselves, and then calling on the Secretary of State to provide suitable support to achieve those aims. First one, but I think, okay. I mean, I'm not a medical practitioner. I don't know what the risks about that would be, but I'm presuming that someone has figured that that's a manageable risk, and therefore that's something, pharmacists do indeed go through lots of training. It's not something they do off the back of a YouTube video. But the second one, that would be great if the city were solving that. They could probably start doing the same thing with dentists if there was a way to do it. My question would be, if GP surgeries haven't been able to recruit GPs, are the city council going to be any more successful in recruiting them?
Oh, and I think this is an interesting motion for me, and I think that this is one to really kind of dig into, because whereas we were a little critical of the previous motion because the identification of need wasn't there. In the case of getting a GP appointment in Portsmouth, the need is clear and evident. The numbers don't lie. The ratios are awful. Any kind of anecdotal experience of trying to find a GP appointment is incredibly difficult. I know my own surgery should have 5 full-time GPs, and currently it's got, I don't think it's actually got 2 FTEs. I think it's got 1 full-time and 1 that does just under part-time. So, those positions are there to be filled, and you know from what I can see evidentially, they just can't. There is a shortage of GPs nationwide, and you're in a position where there are plenty of spaces for them, but there isn't a big cupboard full of GPs somewhere. So to your point, I think there's an element of, if the council could hire them, I kind of get that. But I guess, what's the council going to do? Maybe this talks to a motion we're going to come to later down the list. Hiring a GP is one thing. Putting them in a surgery with all the requisite equipment and infrastructure of receptionists and nurses and all those great people that support the work of the GPs. It that's an endeavour and a half. And as we've already got those things sat about with locked offices with all the stuff in it just without a GP in it, this almost strikes me as is this another gesture motion?
I mean, I don't know. On the flip side, if the council somehow have the ability to cross departments or press the levers of power that are, you know, preventing perhaps GPs wanting jobs in the city, then maybe there are things that they can do that a practice on their own can't do. I don't know. I guess it's worth them trying. I just kind of find it. Yeah, I get your point of, are they talking about recruiting GPs to help them fill the vacancies in existing practices, or are they talking about setting up their own practices? The motion doesn't say that, to be fair.
No.
And when we were discussing the show, we had kind of considered inviting people on, and Matthew Winnington had said that he was willing to actually come on and discuss it in a pre-recorded segment. But we decided that in order to get through the whole agenda, by the time, if we'd had several different people on, that kind of makes it a bit harsher for us to kind of get through. And then most people would probably want to talk about the motions after the council meeting, after they've recovered, and kind of discuss them there. So our door, or our virtual window, is open for Councillor Winnington next week to tell us how we've got the wrong end of the stick on that one, perhaps. But yeah, it'll be great if they can. It's obviously a desperate need. Whether the council can be better at that than existing doctor surgeries, which interestingly enough are obviously, despite the frontward facing of it being a no charging part of the NHS, doctors' surgeries are private businesses operating within the NHS.
Yes, yeah, no, that's a really good point, Simon, that I think most people don't realise, in terms of, well, it's got to stand against privatising the NHS. Well, actually, we've been privatising GP surgeries forever. They've always been a private business, and yeah, this is where, again, I do wonder whether and again, I've talked about the physical bricks and mortar building, and all the stuff that goes with that. I guess in this post-pandemic era, all through the pandemic, your first port of call with your GP would have been a virtual, a virtual kind of Zoom appointment. And again, if I go back probably 10 years, my mum lived over in Gosport, and Gosport has had a chronic shortage, even worse than Portsmouth, for at least 10 years. And I know, back in the day then, it was pre-Zoom, but yeah, you didn't get to see a GP in the flesh, as it were. It was all done by your first port of call was you got a telephone, a telephone appointment. So I wonder whether, this is a bigger question around the model changing. And I guess if Portsmouth City Council did have 4 GPs sat working virtually that people could access, then
that's another point. It doesn't have to be a physical
yeah,
physical surgery, does it? That, there are a wealth of different ways to look at it, and maybe this is something we could do. Let's see if it works, and maybe it will, maybe it won't. But you've got to do something, I guess. Maybe, I don't know. Let's see how it works, and hear from Matthew.
Yes, and I think back to your point on pharmacists. I think many people don't recognise what advice a pharmacist can give. So perhaps wouldn't be thinking of a pharmacist if there is a backlog in GP appointments, you can't get one. I think people tend to escalate, whereas perhaps the pharmacist might be the first port of call. I think people tend to go, can't get hold of my GP, so potentially can then end up going into the walk-in centre, and the walk-in centre then leads them to A&E, and we get a massive logjam there as well. So I think, cause, I think we can definitely agree on, in terms of whether this is a viable solution. Let's see how it goes.
Indeed. And Lee Hunt joins the chat to say the same goes for dentists, police, and most 999 services. So I don't think it means that Portsmouth City Council are talking about recruiting their own police officers, but I think it means that essentially most face-to-face interactions with the public have disappeared over the last few years. But in the same actually as the first motion, they have for because how people interact and how people use services has changed, and therefore these these tax paid services will need to change their operating models, and perhaps we're seeing perhaps a bit of an evolution of that. I don't know, maybe, you know.
Yeah, and I think that it's a valid area to look at, because, as you say, there is some parallels here. You know, again, I find the whole, you know, there needs to be a physical bricks and mortar bank thing to be. I find that a sort of very strange kind of situation, because I can't think what I would do in a bank that I can't do by telephone or by internet or by, you know. And I get digital exclusion. I do get those things, but yeah, I you know, am I going to go and cash a check? And I guess if you're a trader that deals in cash, yes, you're going to want to do that. But I'm guessing if you're a trader, you'll find, you know, you just might have to drive a bit further. So yes, that's the medical one. Now the next motion is interesting and fairly complex, I think, in its nature, which is about increasing access, participation in, or expanding participation in local democracy. And this has been brought by Cal Corkery and
That is and
Kirsty Meller. So two of our Charles Dickens candidates, Charles Dickens councillors rather. And again, this is a motion which explores a number of different avenues in terms of basically trying to get greater engagement with local politics. It talks a lot about the turnouts in the different wards across Portsmouth. I know it's something we've focused on every year when we do the hustings. Is that, you know, we have typically turnouts in, I would say, some of the more affluent wards are 40% plus, Eastleigh and Craneswater topping the tree there. But in perhaps the areas which are considered to be perhaps more deprived, or that participation can drop to under 20%. So there's also a focus within this motion about looking at trying to expand increasing democracy to people with learning difficulties. And yeah, I mean, when I look at this, you know, for me, the more people that, you know, engage with local democracy, you know, the better. You know, again, if we didn't believe that, we wouldn't be here every Sunday evening and running around during the week trying to work out how we're going to fill an hour some weeks. And so yeah, I mean, it does talk to does talk in the turnouts in the. Oh,
sorry, don't worry, that was me.
that's all right. It does also suggest, it mentions that there should be virtual hustings, which I think we've been.
Hello.
Hello. This is yes, we'd like to put ourselves forward. But one thing I think it did show us that we hadn't thought of is, you know, we tend to do our hustings ward by ward. We haven't until next year invited all of the local group leaders to come on to a virtual hustings, which I think, based on this motion, cheers Cal and Kirsty. You put it down first, but we'll definitely be offering that service for next May's local elections.
Yeah, indeed. We'd certainly would like to offer that if people would be happy to take it up on it. And indeed, we've expanded the hustings that we've done kind of each year. So we'd certainly be happy to do them in any ward next year where we've got at least two of the candidates willing to do it. But certainly leadership is certainly worth exploring. That's a good one. Yeah, so I think this motion, I mean, it talks about a lot of wordy things. It talks about every citizen has the right to take part in the local democracy, and how low turnout undermines the veracity of our democracy, and that massive variance from between, you know, one ward and another that you spoke of. And, you know, fundamentally, does that mean that the democracy is failing the people in those wards, or does that mean that the people in those wards are are failing the democracy? Probably a little bit of both. And you could, if you looked at the figures granularly, you could probably figure out that a large portion of the voters in Charles Dickens are actually transient voters, because they're because a lot of the student accommodation is in Charles Dickens, and therefore they may or may not be likely to vote. So that might kind of push their, to be fair, might push their voter turnout actually down artificially. But from a perspective of, and the motion says that the council does some great things, and the officers in the council do some great things about encouraging people to register to vote and encouraging participation, but there's more that needs to be done to reach out and engage with people that are digitally disadvantaged, or people with learning disabilities, or with people with other access restrictions that mean that their ability to attend to take part in our democracy, but also contribute to it, not just at election times. So I think there's some really key points here. Lee Hunt also mentions about it might possibly be speaking to the upcoming changes to the electoral legislation about the need to about the need for ID to vote, and whether that would disenfranchise and disadvantage people further. That was easy for me to say. So yeah, there's certainly some traditionally marginalised and excluded groups. Anything that can be done to encourage them to take part, and actually, to be blunt, for the elected representatives and for officers at the council to actually listen to what they've got to say, is the key thing. It's one thing getting them to take part. It's another thing to actually listen to and take on board what they're saying, because that might not be funny. They might not be easy things to listen to if they're feeling tremendously failed by the current system. And maybe that's the case. But yeah, some interesting things there about reporting back in this municipal year. So that's by basically the end of by May next year, to ensure greater access and engagement in local democracy. So to me, with my kind of project head on, that should be something that's really easy to track. Of, what the current level of engagement is, you should be able to then track to see whether it improves because of the measures that you put in place. And anything that gets more people involved, all the power to it. Whatever that might be, I think we should do it.
Yeah, I think we should. The only thing that I kind of raise I'm going to raise half an eyebrow on it.
Okay.
Simply because there is an element of I do wonder whether this motion is actually asking the political parties or asking the council to do the work of the politicians. And the reason why I kind of throw this into the mix, Simon, is that if we look at our near neighbour of Paulsgrove and Port Solent, Paulsgrove and Port Solent typically had a turnout that was pretty similar to Charles Dickens, wasn't it? It was very low, so sort of just over the 20%. And George Madrick of the Independents, in his first year, basically did a lot of legwork in Paulsgrove because of the two named bits of the ward. The people in Port Solent tended to vote, the people in Paulsgrove less so. He targeted Paulsgrove very heavily and saw the turnout absolutely rocket. I mean, I think it went from circa 20% to about, I want to say it was nearly mid 30s, so nearly doubling the turnout, because there was an engaging message that people got behind. And I don't want to be too nice to George, but there's an element that says, if the people looking to be elected can engage through their own means and through whatever message that they're giving, because, and again, if I look at Charles Dickens, it has become a really strong Labour, it's a Labour stronghold now. It's got the monopoly. All three are red, so they can build hotels or student accommodation on there. I think that's how it works. But there's this element that if any other party was able to go in and put concerted effort into the Charles Dickens ward, you actually don't have to motivate many people to turn out to to change the colour of Charles Dickens from red to any other colour. So I do wonder whether there is, whilst I think everything in here is noble and we should be doing it, I guess my question is that the job of the political parties to to offer those people who now don't bother to vote something to motivate them to get out and do it.
Yeah, I don't know how it wouldn't be their part of, basically something that they're invested in and interested in. I think obviously political parties are going to want more people to want to vote for them, whether they're existing registered voters or registered but not voting voters. But at the end of the day, I can't speak universally, but our democracy is sounder when more people take part, regardless of how they vote, even whether how they vote is the same, is a different way than I would vote or opposing. But that's just how democracy works, and you've got to decisions are made by those who turn up, as the saying goes. And I just think that at the end of the day, if you don't take part, even if you are, as Lee Hunt says, even if you are actually happy with what's going on, if you don't turn up and vote, then you risk actually turning the decision over to the people that do turn up and vote a different way and might actually upset perhaps the things that are actually working. So either way, whether you're happy or unhappy, vote. Because that's the only legitimate way to change things, and it's it's this brilliant ability that we have, or in our case, 3 out of every 4 years, we've got this ability to fundamentally change the makeup of our local council and change how our cities run. So let's do that, because it's certainly better than any of the alternatives. It's not perfect, but it's better than the other options. But I worry about anything that's gonna risk disenfranchising and alienating people any further, and anything the council and political parties can do, it should be great. To me, I'd want to see political parties are quite good at setting up street stalls. To me, I'd set them up in the middle of areas where there are low voting turnouts, have a stall for every party there, and basically say, here we are, come and speak to us, we'll tell you what we're about.
I think there's
then basically have someone from the council there, regardless of whether a particular political party has convinced someone that they're worthy of that resident's support, but then there's someone from the council there ready to register someone to vote if they're not already registered to vote. I think anything that they could be doing, if anything desperately needs doing that needs to be cross-party, this is one of the things, or perhaps that because of that nature, that's why the council officers have to do it, because it needs to be seen to be non-partisan. But in that respect, you quite often hear from the conversations that that was just a cat moving its tail over your microphone. But the people that I speak to that say, "Oh, I never bother to vote because I don't know who to vote for." Well, okay, well then let's fix that. Let's get them in contact with the people that can show them what the different party's about without the point scoring and the snarkiness, so that they can make a decision as to who deserves their vote. Let's do that. Maybe I'm naive. I don't know.
Absolutely. Time is moving on. The cat is warning us. We've got 3 more to get through.
Yes. So the next one was reinstating the shareholder committee. So interestingly, and this one was from Scott Pater Harris and Councillor Brent, to basically so the shareholder committee essentially is meant to exist to oversee and advise the cabinet and the council on the operations of the companies that the council owns or partly owns. And apparently the shareholder committee, when they met last, they decided that they weren't needed and disbanded themselves. I personally, considering that the administration can change, and that the leadership of the council can change, I think there's a benefit in there being some sort of continuity and involvement in of all of the parties actually being and the non-party representation within the council, because at the end of the day, the shareholders aren't the council. The shareholders are the people of Portsmouth, and therefore they need to be fully respected, not just the administration. So I'd like to see that. I think this makes sense to me. I think that's perfectly understandable that should be there, and maybe some of the mysteries around some of the company dealings that seem to come up as political footballs. Depending on which party you talk to or listen to, they'll talk about Victory Energy. They'll talk about the examples of other kind of council companies or things. But at the end of the day, if these things are out in the open and these decisions are made openly with a consensus of the representatives of the shareholders all in agreement of a particular way that a particular company is going, then to me that then doesn't become a political issue or something that ends up on a leaflet of these people did this with all your money and didn't tell you, they're liars.
Yep, and I think you're spot on. And the more I thought about this, if you're a registered charity, you have to have a board of trustees which oversees the board, the executive. If you're if you're a listed company, then your shareholders, there's an annual general meeting. But what we seem to have here is effectively the PCC are almost like like a private owner that has effective, over. They're the only people with oversight. So no, I think this seems to make perfect sense, and I'm slightly confused as to why the shareholder committee sat themselves, but maybe that'll come out in the wash.
Maybe so, indeed. In the interest of time.
Now,
Civic is sustainability.
offices. Yeah, Ryan Brent and Lee Mason. Now, this is one, again, it's my own team, but this was mired in political speak. And if you started reading it, you might have been thinking that the spirit of Jacob Rees-Mogg was upon it, suggesting that all of the people should be coming back to the office and working jolly bloody hard because we know the slackers are doing nothing at home. But actually, if you read it through, it kind of makes sense. It's saying that the civic offices pre-pandemic, full of a lot of people doing council work. Post-pandemic, most people now are working in what the catchphrase I think is in a blended way, which is that they are working, sometimes in the office, but sometimes at home, probably with the balance being more at home than in the office. So what we've got now is a Portsmouth Civic Offices building that we are paying to maintain and to keep watertight and all of those good things and heated and lit. But there are many fewer people in the building now. So there is a question around, well, what should we be doing in response? Because it feels like there is an acceptance that we're not going to go back to forcing everybody to commute into the office every day.
Yeah, I must admit, when I first looked at this, I thought this was echoes of Jacob Rees-Mogg basically saying everybody should be back into the office, people should be back into the office, or this sort of stuff. But actually, when you read into it, it's not just saying that; it's actually saying, aren't there concerns about people being in the right place to serve the residents of Portsmouth? Because there are some front-facing roles that need facing in person. Obviously you can work from home if you're dealing with queries over the phone, for example, but you can't do that at a counter. So there are some examples, but the truth is the world has changed. COVID has perhaps accelerated this, and it's a realistic expectation that if we do not need all of that office space anymore, just like lots of other large organizations, then we should probably start having a reasonable conversation about what else we do with that space.
Yep.
Whether it's rented out, whether it's redeveloped, it's probably in prime location for if you were going to commute to London, or probably halls of residence, or exactly anything like that, or whatever those uses might be. But from that perspective, again, to me, sounds like an entirely reasonable question to ask: of are we working in the best way possible, and does our use of assets reflect that the basically the new normal?
Yeah, and I think you are spot on with the, it is that element of recognizing that the world has changed, and in light of that, there are much more efficient and effective ways to run your business than have lots and lots of empty offices that are not getting any younger. So no, this one, hopefully this one gets through, and that brings us neatly on to, I think, the final motion of the list.
Penultimate.
Penultimate, there are two.
Yeah, park homes. We can
Oh,
easily.
park. Right, park homes very quickly, and I'll save you blushes on this one. Park homes, caravan park, mobile homes. For some reason, the Lib Dem put a 10% sales tax on people selling their homes. Then they've said, no, no, no. After a massive furore, as there should have been, it only applies to new People who buy them, they'll only pay the 10% when they sell them. This is going to make the council no money at all. It could be another 30, 40 years before people start. So, 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. This is a stupid decision. It penalises a group of people who are, let's face it, at the lower end of the property market. So, look, at this point, would you please just hold your hands up and say, sorry, we got this wrong, and reverse it?
Yeah, to me, this kind of I don't see how this meets the balance of political pain versus benefit ratio of,
Yep.
because any benefit that's going to be is not actually going to be that big and isn't going to come for like 10, 15 years, and all of the pain is now. And if anything, all it seems to have done is given the Tories something to campaign on in Eastleigh and Cosham. So yeah, I
And rightly
don't.
so, because it is a
Yeah.
hideous own goal by the Lib Dems, and my hope is, and it just seems such an un-Lib Dem policy. I don't, again, I don't know whether somebody had a cheese dream or what went on, but it's wrong. Stop it.
Okay, moving on.
And finally, I'm going to let you cover this one because this one's there's nuances and complexities, and this is another one that gets the Pompey Politics podcast stamp of, oh, leave the bloody political speak out and get to the point of what it is you're asking for, because that's good and your rhetoric isn't.
Yeah, I mean, listeners will note that we tend to strip that out when we're talking, because we get to actually what the policy is rather than talking about the political speak within it, because everybody likes to score points, but that's not necessarily how you win the game. I'm sure there's a motto about that. Anyway, so this motion from Judith Smythe and from Graham Heaney talks about the cost of living crisis, and about basically as rising energy costs bear down on people in winter, with the as would have been covered at length in the cost of living motion earlier on. Basically, what this calls on the council to do is to work with local community groups to develop a list of perhaps suitable premises that can, for daytime use, be publicised as places where people that perhaps can't afford to heat their own homes can go to get warm this winter.
And for me, this, and again, it's interesting this one came last, and I really do hope that by the time they get to it, everybody hasn't lost the will to live, because I think this actually speaks to quite a number of the motions that are on go before it. What it's talking to for me is about community hubs, and it's talking about social isolation. And again, as we just picking out some of the motions that we've been through, we spoke about Hilsea Community Centre. We've spoken about, well, we need the bank because, people might be, they want to do these things in person because they're digitally isolated. Well, there is an element of you're never too old to learn how to use a tablet. We're talking about the cost of living crisis. Well, ultimately, a warm place is a warm place. We've spoken about the civic offices and people working from home. I like to think I was a trendsetter back in 2018, where I worked from home full time. And I'll be honest with you, I found it very socially isolating. By the time everybody had left at 8:30, there would be nobody in till 5:30, 6 o'clock. It was just me and my dog. So the idea of creating community spaces which are warm and welcoming and inviting, we'll go back to that motion on, increasing voter participation. Again, I see nothing but good in this motion if we can strip away well, we wouldn't have to bloody have one if the Tories were. If we can strip that away, creating thriving community hubs where people who are elderly or with young children or working from home or from those disenfranchised and marginalized groups, if they can come together and be warm as a community, what's not to like?
I find it hard to disagree with any of that, so I'm not going to. So yes, there are lots of council premises that will be open. I guess the difference here is what's being called for warm and welcoming spaces for people to basically go and spend some time in. So perhaps a slight kind of a slight change in in perhaps their current use model.
Yeah.
That probably wouldn't, I don't think would actually involve that much investment really. But from a perspective of actually, if anything, one thing we've learned from the COVID situation is that communities will support each other, and there's a strong community spirit in the city. And these community organisations, whether they are council run or run by a third party, I can see them quite easily being really, really up for this. I think it's a good idea. And if I'm really honest, I think otherwise by August the government are going to be asking councils to form this list anyway, so we might as well do it now.
Absolutely. So on that bombshell, where I have spoke passionately in agreement with a Labour motion, we've got through all 11. It's 18:27, and you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sansbury. So join us next week where we'll have a roundup of the full council meeting. So we'll invite on some councillors once they've recovered from their marathon hot evening in the full council chamber. But join us next week, the 6:27 on Sunday for our last show before we also take a summer break for August.